Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for September 5th, 2022. Today we're going to take a look at the question of whatever happened to democracy. Now, last December there was this so-called Summit for Democracy, where a line was drawn between the so-called democratic nations and the so-called autocratic or authoritarian nations. This was done to lay the basis for the transatlantic policy of escalating the attacks on Russia and China by defining them as autocracies, as totalitarian states that had to be resisted by an alliance of the so-called democracies. This also included an attempt to bully the southern nations to support the transatlantic region against Russia and China, to force them to accept the idea that they have no sovereign powers, but they have to be part of the unipolar order, or what Anton Blinken calls the rules-based order. Now, an example of this was the defense of Ukraine as a sovereign democratic nation. The present government of Ukraine which is propped up by Western money, by Western arms, is hardly democratic. Transparency International lists it as one of the most corrupt nations on earth. They've shut down opposition parties. They've shut down political figures. They've shut down media that go against the government. Now, on top of that, they've set up a committee to combat disinformation, which, working together with a hit team called Miratvorets, is targeting opposition figures from around the world, putting them on what some intelligence experts are calling a kill list. Hardly democratic, huh? And has there been any protest of this from Western democratic nations? When Daria Dugina was assassinated in a car bomb, and Miratvorets put out her picture with a red line through it saying liquidated, not only was there no protest, but Western governments flocked to a meeting September 1st and 2nd by these criminals, in which they justified the designation of opponents of the Ukraine war as information terrorists. So what we're seeing is the criminalization of disagreement with the fundamental narrative of the transatlantic powers. So let's examine the state of democracy in the so-called democratic world, starting with the case of Germany. Now, maybe you saw over the weekend the statement from German Foreign Minister Baerbock, who is from the Green Party and is one of the most outspoken supporters of the war in Ukraine, committing the German government to provide endless amounts of arms and money to back up the fight. She said in this speech the other day that support for Ukraine is unconditional, even if the war lasts for years and imposes hardships on the German people. Remember, she's in the German government. Here's what she said: "Our government will continue to support Ukraine no matter what my German voters think." Did you hear that? No matter what my German voters think. Is that democratic? Now, the latest poll should tell her what they think. Only 29% of the German voters polled believe the present German government is competent. The head of the German Industrial Association, Herr Rostform, said, quote, the policies of the present government, or due to the policies of the present government, the substance of German industry is threatened. He said, we're facing, quote, a dramatic plunge in production, unquote. And he went through some of the figures on this. As firms are closing, people are losing jobs. Now, even Baerbock's Green Party sidekick, Robert Habeck, who's the economics minister and vice chancellor, told the Financial Times when asked about the situation, he said, quote, it is alarming, unquote. He said, some firms have completely ceased to produce. And he added that a whole set of industries are experiencing, quote, a collapse, a structural collapse. This is the Germany which until recently was one of the most productive economies in the world. And what did Baerbock say? They will continue this policy, quote, no matter what my German voters think. We see a similar thing in the United Kingdom. Later today, it's expected that Liz Truss will be confirmed as a replacement for Boris Johnson. Her policies are the same as Johnson's, except possibly even worse. 6 out of 10 British firms are expected to go bankrupt in the next months. The inflation rate is expected to top 20% in the United Kingdom. And what's the cause? Sanctions, the green policy, and the neoliberal economic policy. These are not caused by Putin. These were imposed by the would-be elites of the Western world based on a desire to sustain the terms of the neoliberal unipolar world order, which includes wars and regime change against any governments that refuse to go along. And if you protest this, you're accused of being a Putin puppet or a Putin agent. Now, what about the United States? Well, we saw this really quite insane speech by Joe Biden in Philadelphia last weekend in front of a red background, which looked like he was speaking from the bowels of hell. Now, his handlers in writing the speech are contributing to the criminalization of dissent. This is an anti-American policy to say that if you disagree with the policy, you are a potential terrorist or a semi-fascist. Now, what is the Western policy? The Western policy is to weaken Russia using Ukraine, to target China. These policies are pushing the world toward nuclear war. At the same time, the so-called anti-inflation policy, the inflation was caused by a 20-year, or now it's actually 14-year commitment to bailing out bankrupt firms by pumping liquidity into the hands of speculators to buy and sell assets that are essentially worthless, which increases the inflation, weakens the dollar, but continues the flow of funds from the average person into the hands of the billionaires. And what do they say they're going to do? They're going to continue this, which will punish the majority of citizens. As Jerome Powell, the Federal Reserve Chairman, admits, you're going to experience pain, but it's necessary to fight inflation. Well, that's not true at all. But what we see with the Biden policy is to criminalize those who would oppose it by attacking Trump supporters as a threat to democracy or as semi-fascists, is further drawing lines. And it's a provocation of both the left and the right, the so-called left and right, which are arbitrary designations, but they're committing them toward increased confrontation, conflict, and possible civil war. Now, here's a question for the Biden people to answer. How can someone whose government is funneling tens of billions of dollars of weapons and aid to the government of Ukraine, which includes in its defense and security forces avowedly pro-Nazi elements, how can a U.S. government justify that and at the same time refer to its opponents in the United States as semi-fascists? Who's funding the neo-Nazis in Ukraine? It's not MAGA, it's the Biden administration. Now, what's the other aspect of this? By criminalizing dissent, what's being done is to provoke a violent confrontation, which will then lead to a deepening of the measures of police state totalitarian methods, supposedly to keep the peace. This police state, which went into high gear with the Patriot Act following the 9/11 events, has never been repudiated. People say they don't like it, they don't support it, but the NSA is still engaged in spying on average Americans, including even spying on the presidential campaign of Donald Trump in 2016. So who's speaking out against this? Instead, you have people fighting on the issues which are of secondary importance, getting all riled up, using things like the raid on Trump's Mar-a-Lago House as a basis for generating more anger among the MAGA crowd, and then using the Roe v. Wade decision to rile up the Biden crowd. But in the meantime, we're perched on the edge of thermonuclear war and depression collapse. And if you speak out on those issues, you're an information terrorist. Now, we have been presenting alternatives to this for years. Some of you have asked the question, well, what can be done? In the short time I have now, I'm just going to encourage you to register for the conference coming up on September 10th and 11th, where we will be presenting the alternatives to this descent into chaos, which is being done in the name of democracy.